Whoa, what a night. I thank you for coming. They insisted I have someone with me when walking over here from the White House, though it's only minutes away. If I do come alone, which they hate, I'm obliged to carry a cane or this tatty umbrella. Imagine anyone wanting to do me harm. It is a little singular that I, who am not a vindictive man, should have always been before the people in canvases marked for their bitterness. Blow winds and crack your cheeks, rage blow your cataracts and hurricanos, spout till you have drenched our steeples, drown the cocks. As King Lear, I take no credit. I learned that particular passage from Scott's lessons in elocution when I was a boy, but I never seen any of Shakespeare's plays performed until I was president. And now I never miss if I can help it. Let's see what Homer Bates has left me. Homer's on duty tonight along with a couple of the other boys. I doubt if there's much. It's too early. Last spring I saw Edwin Booth in a trio of plays, Hamlet, Julius Caesar, and Richard III. All very good. Though to me it matters not if Shakespeare be well or ill acted. The thought suffices. 4 years ago, I waited for returns with some of you in the Springfield telegraph office, an election that decided my presidential fate. Now here we are again 4 years later in the telegraph office of the War Department, waiting for returns that will decide the fate of the nation. I make no predictions. Oh, Indianapolis, 1,500 in our column. Well, that's better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. Let's hope Indiana goes the same way. We did well enough in last month's state elections. We took 8 of 11 seats, 12 in Ohio, but Pennsylvania was streaked with lean, and that state carries enormous weight. This local feud between Governor Curtin and my former Secretary of War hasn't helped. If you recall, Congress was on his tail over some no-bid defense contracts, which may or may not have benefited him. Well, the Secretary may be a loose cannon, but he is certainly no thief. After he resigned, I made him a minister and sent him to Russia. He didn't stay long enough to unpack. A week later, or so it seemed, he was back in Pennsylvania politics, ruffling feathers. Anyhow, this feud started our ticket down there, so who knows? Personally, I care nothing for re-election. But if our divisions defeat us, I fear for the country. 2 months ago, I wouldn't have given a plug nickel for my chances. Horrendous losses in the wilderness, Spotsylvania and Petersburg left me no choice but to draft 500,000 men. I was urged to postpone the call-up until after the election. Didn't do it. We must have the men. Then it was suggested that the election itself be postponed or canceled. Well, I never considered it. We cannot have a free government without elections. If the rebellion could force us to forego or postpone a national election, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and reversed us. Well, that position scared the dickens out of some wealthy party wags who wanted me replaced on the ticket altogether, conjured up a second Republican convention in Cincinnati with the idea of putting General Fremont forward. Got nowhere. Sherman took Atlanta and Farragut Mobile. So here I am, bent but not broken. If I go down, I'll go down like the Cumberland, with colors flying. I had hoped to get back to Springfield to vote, but things being as they are, I couldn't get away. Not sure which way Illinois will go. 4 years ago, I was dubbed the rail splitter candidate. Now the country is split and bleeding, and many blame me. I got that rail splinter handle from my cousin John Hanks, who showed up at the state convention with 2 fence rails we were supposed to have split in the Sangamon Bottom in 1830. I said I couldn't guarantee those particular rails were mine, but I could guarantee I split rails around that time. I even traded split rails for a new pair of trousers. I believe the bargain was 400 rails for every yard of cloth. I must have split 1,400 and still came up short. Those trousers barely reached my ankles. First thing Mary did after we were married was to take me to a haberdasher and get me measured up for a good suit. That set me back $100. And she's been spending ever since, only now she's spending the government's money, redecorating the White House. To be fair, the place was looking a little seedy after Buchanan left. Of course, that was in the early days before we lost Willie to the fever. 12 days after he was stricken, he was gone. Gone. Nearly broke me. We have Tad, of course, who's 11, and Robert, who I never see, Harvard. I did go there on one occasion, gave a speech. I think Robert was a little embarrassed, proud too, I think, or I hope. The trouble was I was riding the circuiter at the courthouse with various cases when he came to us. We saw little of each other, so there's a distance, which I regret. After Harvard, he wanted to enlist, was eager to join up, but his mother wasn't keen. Finally, I asked General Grant to find him a spot in the Army of the Potomac, which he did. Now Mary worries and blames me. She'll have to get in line. Now still, the boy wants to serve, and I don't blame him. When I was his age, in between careers, Black Hawk crossed the Mississippi with 400 Sac warriors, wanted to return to his tribal lands, which had been bargained away in what he then considered a bad bargain. So I volunteered for the 31st Illinois State Militia. The most pleasure and satisfaction of my life was being elected captain of that Sangamon company of soldiers. I guess you didn't know I was a military man. Yes, I fought, bled, and came away. Oh no, I was not at Stillman's defeat, but I was near the place very soon afterwards. It's quite certain I never broke my sword, for I had none to break. But I bent a musket pretty bad on one occasion. I had a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes. And although I never fainted from loss of blood, I was often very hungry, marching up and down both sides of the Rock River in search of an elusive enemy. And I'm just enough of a politician to know there was not much doubt about my nomination at the Baltimore Convention. But about this thing, I am far from certain. I wish I were certain. I'll tell you who else was in that Black Hawk War was Jefferson Davis and John Todd Stewart, Logan as well. Stewart was the first to suggest that I take up the law. After I mustered out, I got a copy of Blackstone's commentaries, had jury duty on a few occasions, watched those lawyers, most of whom were self-educated like me, and I saw that it might scour. In time, I walked or rode the 16 miles to Springfield and plundered Stewart's law books. This was before he was elected to Congress. I'd given up the blacksmith idea by then. It was too much like hard work. Of course, Lee and Grant both fought in our recent war with Mexico. Now here they are in two different camps. If I had any chance of being reelected to Congress, my opposition to that war cost me the opportunity. Judge Douglas was still rubbing my nose in it years later during our debates for the Senate. Spotty Lincoln this and Spotty Lincoln that, reminding everyone, in case they had forgotten, that I stood up in the House and challenged President Polk to prove that we owned the spot in which the first blood of the Mexican-American War was shed. Well, that put me in the soup with the veterans, along with a string of others. Even my patriotism was questioned. But when I made that challenge, the war was nearly over. Once we were in it, I always voted to fund the troops. And I stuck around Washington afterwards to help Zachary Taylor, a hero of that war, be elected president. Now, my point was a legal one. The Constitution gives war-making powers to Congress, not to the president. I felt no one man should have the power to bring that kind of oppression upon the country, especially over disputed territory. General Taylor agreed with me. Yes, I know there are now some who accuse me of executive tyranny because I instituted the draft and suspended habeas corpus, but the situation is entirely different. I am trying to save the country. President Polk, a slaveholder, wanted to extend slavery into new federal territories gained from that war. Now here we are years later trying to pick up the pieces. Still pains me to bring it up. Mary's on the edge. The election, Robert in the army, the war, my safety, her safety. She was returning to the soldiers' home where we lived during the summer months. It's cooler than the city. Well, the driver's seat came away, the horses bolted, and Mary was thrown out of the carriage. She hit her head in a rock and was poorly for a good 3 weeks. Her lengthy convalescence was partly fear, I think. She convinced herself that the carriage had been sabotaged. The bolts in the driver's seat were apparently loose or had been loosened. But I find it does no good to think on these things, or we shall never go out. She will just have to let Robert go. Take his chances. It was Tad who could use the attention. He runs around the house pestering a company of Pennsylvania bucktails quartered in the East Room, along with his pet turkey, who roams there on occasion. Today he came rushing into my office. He wanted me to watch the soldiers cast their absentee ballots before their state commissioner. We could see them from the window all lined up. I asked him if his turkey intended to vote. Well, no, he said, he's not of age. Not of age. 11 years old. Well, he may not be much with his books, but he's a quick-witted lad. This whole thing may come down to the soldier vote. I did ask Sherman to furlough the Indiana boys for last month's state election, but I didn't think it right to extend their leave for this one. The general's marching through Georgia in a few days. Can't hold him up just because it might cost me the election. Assuming the Indiana lads would have voted my way. We did furlough federal employees here in the district, freeing them to cast their ballots, and camps and hospitals were emptied to do the same. And we sent a government steamer down the Mississippi to collect the sailor votes from our gunboat crews. Someone said if there was no other way, I would take a carpetbag and collect those votes myself. Well, maybe not, but Mary might. She's that anxious. I am told that the Democrats expect General McClellan to take 2/3 of the soldier vote in every state. Given the choice between peace and war, they are betting that the soldiers will choose McClellan's peace platform. But I have been to City Point many times, talked to the men in the camps and the hospitals, and I feel they are for their country, even if that means more war. Frankly, I'd rather lose the election with the soldier vote than be elected without it. Anyway, it is out of my hands. If the people support the Union cause, they will act in the best interests of the country and the world. On the other hand, if they should resolve to have immediate peace, even at the loss of their country and their liberty, I know not the power of the right to resist them. It's their own business, and they must do as they please with their own. The decision they make will determine the weal and the woe of the nation. God knows I do not want the labor and responsibility of the office for another 4 years, but I have the common pride of humanity to wish my administration endorsed, and I want the opportunity to finish the job of putting down the rebellion and restoring peace and prosperity to the country. I think McClellan will take New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, all the border states, and Illinois. Now that would give him 114 electoral votes. I should get 117 from all the others, possibly 3 more from the new state of Nevada. Now if that proves to be the outcome, it will not scour. The moral effect of such a close-run thing would be broken, and my power to prosecute the war and make the peace would be greatly impaired. It'd be like having a gun to my head. Reminds me of the occasion when I was accosted by a man who actually did stick a gun to my head. Well, what's the matter? I asked him. Well, the man told me that some years back he had sworn on oath that if he ever came across an uglier man than himself, he'd shoot him. Well, shoot me, I said, for if I am an uglier man than you, I don't want to live. Still, It was a close-run thing. My improved countenance, such as it is, I owe to an 11-year-old girl from Chautauqua County, New York, Grace Bedell. Now, Grace wrote me a letter after I received my party's nomination for president, and in her letter, she suggested that I might look better if I grew whiskers. Well, I replied that having never worn whiskers, some might think it a silly affectation. Still, I took her advice, and when my presidential train taking me from Springfield to the White House stopped near her village, I met Grace, and I told her my new whiskers were grown at her request. I never asked if she thought they were an improvement. That was the high point of my 13-day train ride. The low point was sneaking into Washington after Pinkerton detectives uncover a plot to kill me. Now, the threat seemed genuine as it came from several sources, but I always regretted I let them talk me into it. It was a bad beginning, not at all presidential. And it sent the wrong message to the Upper South and border states that hadn't yet seceded from the Union, made our resolve to resist the rebellion look shaky. And it made me look like a man more concerned with saving his own skin than saving his country, which was by then on the brink of war. If you recall, federal forts, armories, and other federal property had been seized by the Confederacy before I took office. Buchanan did nothing. Now, that policy was untenable if the country were to survive. The most important thing in my mind was not to start the war, not fire the first shot, not shed fraternal blood. If we had, I felt it would have led to the immediate dissolution of the Union. Now, despite claims to the contrary, we did not decide to resupply Fort Sumter to provoke the Confederacy. Nevertheless, our attempt to provision that fort did more service than it otherwise could have. Fort Sumter was attacked and taken, leaving me no choice but to call out the war power of the government and so resist force employed for its destruction by force for its preservation. Loyal states were asked to provide 75,000 militia for 90 days. Well, I had no illusions the war would end by then. But I never dreamt it would continue, as it has for nearly 4 years. With such a loss of life on both sides. Does it not strike you as more than strange that I've been put in charge of prosecuting this war when I'm a man who couldn't cut the head off of a chicken? I did shoot a turkey when I was 8, but thereafter never shot any larger game. For some reason, I couldn't bear cruelty to any animal. I remember giving the boys hell for putting fire on the backs of turtles just to watch them crawl from their shells. I sometimes feel like one of those turtles, catching fire from all quarters. But I mostly manage to ignore the threats, real or imagined. I leave it to others. I do have a pigeonhole in my roll-top desk where I keep all such trivia, read but not by me. Country is not dependent on any one individual. Why should the spirit of mortal be proud, like a swift fleeting meteor, a fast flying cloud, a flash of the lightning, a break of the wave, and passes from life to his rest in the grave? Now here's a boy due to be hung in the morning. I think if a man had more than one life, a little hanging might not hurt him. But after he is once dead, we cannot bring him back. Is it not to be wondered that a boy raised on a farm, in the habit of going to bed of dark when required to watch, fell asleep? My generals say I impair Army discipline with my pardons and respites, but it makes me rested when I think how joyous the signing of my name will make him and his family and his friends. So, the boys shall be pardoned. Well, I don't always take the soldier's side. I recall a letter from one who had been found guilty of stealing $40. He asked for leniency. Said he only taken 30. It reminds me of the Indiana man who charged his neighbor's daughter of unseemly behavior and having 3 illegitimate children. Now, that's a lie, said the neighbor, and I can prove it. She only has 2. And I'd like to Tam O'Shanter's Ride, the poem by Robert Burns. The wind blew as 'twould blown its last, the rattling showers rose on the blast, the speedy gleams the darkness swallowed, loud, deep, and long the thunder bellowed. That night a child might understand. The Dale had business on his hand, well mounted on his grey mare Meg, a better never lifted leg. Tam scuppered through dub and mire, despising wind, rain, and fire, was holding fast his good blue bonnet, was crooning o'er some old Scots sonnet. So it goes. I had that dream again last night. I had it before Antietam, Gettysburg, Murfreesboro, and every event of great national importance. I see a ship sailing away, badly damaged, and our vessels in close pursuit. And I also see the end of the battle, the enemy routed. When I told Grant about my dream, his only comment was, Murfreesboro was no victory. After Willie passed, Mary looked for comfort where she could find it. One of the things she latched on to was spiritualism. She even had seances in the White House and persuaded me to come along on one or two occasions. Said Willie spoke to her. And I wasn't convinced, but I could see it relieved her mind. I do have one presentiment that I shall not last the rebellion, but that is a different matter. Oh, better have Homer wire this boy's regiment, or my pardon won't be worth much. Indiana is ours without the soldier vote. Well, that should take some of the sting out of losing Kentucky, which is dead certain, but not surprising. I was raised in Hardin County, Kentucky, it's true, but my family moved to Perry County, Indiana when I was 7, so I'm not altogether a native son and cannot fault Kentucky for deserting me. My father left Kentucky because he couldn't get a clear title to his land and couldn't afford the legal fight. And then, too, Kentucky being a slave state, it made it harder for small farmers like my father to compete. So he just packed up and moved across the Ohio to Indiana, a free state, staked out a parcel of land near Pigeon Creek. I like to think that Pigeon Creek and Perry County remembered me today when they cast their ballots. That first year was especially bitter because our only shelter was a half-faced camp enclosed on 3 sides with the 4th open to the elements and no floor. Gray's elegy in a country churchyard summed us up. Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur bear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. It reminds me of a poem I wrote after a visit to the graveside of my mother and sister in Spencer County. It's fairly brief and shouldn't try your patience. Here's a sample. My childhood home I see again, and sadden with the view. And still, as memories crowd my brain, there's pleasure in it too. I range the fields with pensive tread, and pace the hollow rooms, and feel companion of the dead. I'm living in the tombs. I learned all of Gray's elegy, along with long stretches from the Bible, Burns, and Byron. Recitation was the primary mode of teaching in those days, but later I did it for my own pleasure, and once I had it, it stuck. My father was illiterate, but determined that I get a good education, and in his mind that meant reading, writing, and ciphering to the rule of 3. I was schooled off and on until I was 15, but it didn't amount to a year altogether. My mother could read, but not write. If she had survived the milk sickness, I imagine I would have had her vote today. Sorrow comes to all and to the young. It comes with bitterest agony because it takes them unawares. I believe I was 9. The year after she passed, my father went back to Kentucky and married Sarah Bush Johnston. My new stepmother brought 3 children, a spinning wheel, furniture, and a pile of books into our lives. Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Arabian Nights. I wore the paper thin plundering those books and any others I could lay my hands on. Yeah, we cleared 80 acres that first year. It was the roughest work a young lad could be made to do, plowing, fencing, killing hogs. I never did like to work, and I don't deny it. I'd rather read, crack jokes, laugh, talk, tell stories, anything but work. Oh, here's one that comes to mind. A circuit preacher rose in the pulpit and announced his text. I'm the Christ, whom I shall represent today. Well, about this time, a little blue lizard ran up his roomy pantaloons. Well, the old preacher, not wishing to interrupt the flow of the sermon, slapped away at his legs, expecting to arrest the intruder. But his efforts were unavailing. Well, continuing the sermon, he next loosened the waistband of his pantaloons, and with a kick, off came that easy-fitting garment. Meanwhile, Mr. Lizard had crossed the equatorial line of the waistband and was calmly exploring that part of the preacher's anatomy that lay underneath the back of his shirt. Desperate, the preacher reached for his collar button, and with one sweep of his arm, off came that toed linen shirt. Well, the congregation sat as dazed. Finally, one old lady rose up and shouted at the top of her voice, "If you represent Christ, then I'm done with the Bible." No offense, I hope. Certainly none intended. Although I don't belong to a church, a condition I had to answer when I ran for Congress in '46, I can promise you that I shall gladly join any church if its sole qualification for membership is obedience to the Bible statement of law and gospel. That's from Secretary Fox, crowing over the defeat of a couple of opponents. Well, he has more the feeling of personal resentment than I. Perhaps I have too little, but I never thought it paid. Man has not the time to spend half his life in quarrels. Any man ceases to attack me, I never remember the past against him. A woman once told me that her idea of a true religious experience was when one was really brought to feel the need of divine help and to seek his aid for strength and guidance. Now, I had lived until Willie died, not fully realizing these things. That blow overwhelmed me. It showed me my weakness as I never felt it before. I can safely say that I now know something of the change of which she spoke. I've been accused of being an atheist and a deist. Neither are true. Although Washington and Jefferson were both deists, they believe in a divine intelligence governing the universe. I myself believe that there is a natural law of harmony, and in that law are self-evident truths. Even as a young boy, I recollect thinking that there must have been something more than common that those men struggled for. Years before I came to this office, I spoke of the dangers to American political institutions being greater now than they had been for the last 50 years. In previous generations, when the outcome of the American venture in self-government was still in doubt, all who sought celebrity and fame and distinction expected to find it in the success of that experiment. Well, now, such is not enough for men of ambition and talent. Towering genius disdains a beaten path. It seeks regions unexplored. It thirsts and burns for distinction, and if possible, it will have it, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving free men. I first saw slavery in Kentucky, and then again in New Orleans when I took a flatboat down there with Allen Gentry, 2,400 miles round trip, to sell his father's goods. There I saw the slave market. And again in St. Louis, 2 years later, my cousin Dennis Hanks and I saw men chained, whipped, and scourged like cattle. When I came to Congress in '47, the slave trade was on display, and an offense and an embarrassment to our nation's capital. I introduced a bill that would have allowed the people to restrict slavery in the district, but it got nowhere. It wasn't enough of an issue at the time. The country, North and South, expected slavery to peter out. Now, that assumption was questioned in '54 when Judge Douglas introduced the Nebraska bill in the Senate, a bill that would, if passed, extend slavery into new federal territories west of the Mississippi. Now, as you know, that bill was passed, and it changed everything. What began as a necessary evil was now being promoted as a positive good. Although volume upon volume is written that slavery is a very good thing, offering the slave security and real freedom, we never hear of the man who wishes to take the good of it by being a slave himself. That bill was conceived in violence, passed in violence, is maintained in violence, and is being executed in violence. And I said as much to Judge Douglas during our debates for the Senate. Those debates went on for hours, of course, but the slavery question was the eye of the storm. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind can rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward until it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. I have always hated slavery, I think, as much as any abolitionist. I've always hated it, but I've always been quiet about it until this new era of the introduction of the Nebraska bill began. I always believed that everybody was against it and that it was in the course of ultimate extinction. The adoption of the Constitution and its attendant history led the people to believe so, and that such was the belief of the framers of the Constitution itself. Now, Judge Douglas looks upon this matter of slavery as an exceedingly little thing, this matter of keeping 1/5 of the population of the whole nation in a state of oppression and tyranny unequaled in the world. He looks upon it as something having no moral question in it, as something on a par with the question of whether a man should pasture his land with cattle or plant it with tobacco. Now, it so happens there is a vast portion of the American people that do not look upon that matter as this very little thing. They look upon it as a vast moral evil, and they can prove it as such by the writings of those who gave us the blessings of liberty. Now, for the purpose of squaring things with the judge's argument of don't care whether slavery be voted up or voted down, for holding that the Declaration of Independence didn't mean anything at all, I ask you in all soberness, if all these things, if ratified, if confirmed and endorsed, if taught to our children and repeated to them, do not tend to rub out the sentiment of liberty in the country and to transform this government to some other form. Now, this argument of the judge is the same old serpent that says, you work and I eat, you toil and I will enjoy the fruits of it. Now, turn it whatever way you will, whether it come from the mouth of a king, an excuse for enslaving the people of his country, or from the mouth of men of one race as a reason for enslaving men of another race. It is all the same old serpent. Let us then turn this government back into the channels in which the framers of the Constitution originally placed it. Let us stand firmly by each other. Let us unite as one people throughout the land, until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal. Let us revere the Declaration of Independence. Let us keep step with the music of the Union. Let us draw a cordon, so to speak, around the hateful institution like a reptile poisoning itself. It will perish by its own infamy. If we cannot give freedom to every creature, let us do nothing that will impose slavery on any other creature. We cannot be free men if this is by our national choice to be a land of slavery. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under the rule of a just God cannot long retain it. We must make this a land of liberty in fact, as it is in name. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it. So on, so forth. Whoa! Well, that'll teach me to get above myself. Reminds me of the evening of the day that they decided the Senate contest between Judge Douglas and myself. It was something like tonight, dark, rainy, and gloomy. The returns being the same, I started for home. Now, the path had been worn hog back and was treacherous. My foot slipped from under me, knocking the other one out of the way. For such an awkward fellow, I am fairly sure-footed. It used to take a pretty dexterous man to throw me. Sangamon County legend has it that I whipped Jack Armstrong, the leader of the Clary Grove Boys, in an epic wrestling match. Well, I don't know who whipped who, but I did get their votes when I ran for the state legislature. Anyhow, I recovered my balance and I lit square, and I said to myself, it's a slip, but not a fall. Now that thought proved prophetic. Although I lost that Senate contest, 2 years later I won the presidency, defeating Judge Douglas in a split Democratic Party. He's gone now, of course. He passed shortly after the election. Despite our differences, I always considered him a friend. We had a lot of history together. Oh, there may have been a bit of jealousy. He courted Mary, before we tied the knot. And then, too, it was said that he tried to paint me as a wealthy aristocrat, Mary being raised on a plantation. But I don't buy it. It's just mischief makers looking to damage me and win votes. People will say anything, and often do. Why, some have accused Mary of being a traitor simply because she has relatives fighting on the Confederate side. When her half-sister Emily lost her husband at Chickamauga, she was barred from returning to her Kentucky home because she wouldn't swear allegiance to the Union. And I issued a pass and invited her to the White House for a few days. One of my generals told me in no uncertain terms that she had to go. Well, I more or less told him the same. Now that Mary can't speak for herself, which I think she has proved to all alike, both North and South, and this was a particularly good thing when we were courting, as I had nothing much at all to say. Well, nothing of a personal nature. I was fine if we talked politics or history, but I had no feeling for the drawing room chit-chat she was raised on. And one thing's for certain, she's hoping for 4 more years at her current address. Slow but steady returns from Pennsylvania. Well, as Pennsylvania goes, so goes the nation, or so they say. Perhaps someone can tell Mrs. Lincoln. She's more anxious tonight, and let's hope Pennsylvania proves prophetic. There was another Mary in my life, before I met Mrs. Lincoln. Go-between, I mention no names. Put it to me that Miss Mary Owens of Kentucky would once again return to New Salem if I would make the pledge. Well, even though I hadn't seen her for 3 years, my memory of her was favorable, so I agreed. But when we met, I barely recognized her. She had gone from pint-sized to beyond plump. It was a drawback, but not a deal breaker. I was no prize chicken. But I worried that she was used to better, and I had nothing much at all to show on that front. Even though I begun to practice law, I was saddled with a debt of $1,100, incurred when a New Salem grocery store I took a half share in went to the wall. My partner inconveniently passed away, but not his creditors, who were very much alive. Although I wasn't legally bound to pay his half, I eventually did, but those creditors had to be extremely patient. Took nearly 17 years to clear what I had dubbed my national debt. Now, as to the Mary Owens proposal, I feared that I could not make the woman happy and only made a half-hearted offer. Well, I needn't have worried. She let it be known that I was not the man she pictured as her ideal husband and turned me down flat. I resolved then and there not ever to marry, as I could never be satisfied with anyone who would be blockhead enough to have me. By the time I met Mrs. Lincoln, I was terrorized by the thought of the whole enterprise. We had a false start or two, but eventually we made the bargain. On the day of the event, someone asked me where I was going. To hell, I suppose, I muttered. No family, just the two of us. A couple of bridesmaids. I vowed to myself to do all in my power to make her happy, and there was nothing I could imagine that would make me more unhappy than to fail in that attempt. Marriage to me was a profound wonder. We boarded at the Globe Tavern for $4 a week. I went back to my office, and Mary bided her time. Even then, she believed I would someday be president, whereas I couldn't imagine such a sucker reaching that high office. Excuse me. Well, the night wears on, but our patience is being rewarded. We have heard from Baltimore, a city that has not always been in our column, especially at the beginning of the rebellion, a city whose citizens, you may remember, shot and killed some of our Massachusetts troops who were on their way to defend the Capitol, which was under threat of imminent attack. And now, nearly 4 years later, Baltimore has come full circle, giving us a majority of 10,000, a fair beginning and a good omen for taking the entire state of Maryland. Oh, and Massachusetts has given us an 80,000 majority. It's expected, but no less gratifying. Tad will be pleased. He's very fond of the Massachusetts Sixth, who were the only northern realities in the district those first days of the war. They fitted him out in a Union uniform, which his mother couldn't get off him. Now he marches around quite smartly. He calls himself the Home Guard, along with his menagerie of pets, I suppose. He's got a pony, a dog, a kitten, a turkey, and a goat. Although Nanny was exiled after tearing up the lawn at the soldiers' home. Mary thinks I'm too indulgent, allowing him the run of the place. But I see him as his brother. I lost my own brother when I was near his age, and later my sister Sarah in childbirth. Well, there's a divinity that shapes our ends. Rough hew them how we will. Oh, here's one that slipped by the boys. If the ballot does not remove the despot, we trust some bold hand will pierce his heart with dagger point for the public good. Pigeonhole fodder. Oh, by the way, I don't mention these threats to Mary, not since that rumpus at the soldiers' home last summer. No, not her carriage accident. This was another occasion when out of the blue, my horse bolted and ran away with me. Well, I thought nothing about it, but the next day a bullet hole was found in the crown of the plug hat I've been wearing, apparently made by some foolish marksman. Not intended for me. I'll say no more about it. I often come over here to escape my persecutors, those long lines of visitors with their gripes and grievances. One day when I was especially besieged and apparently looking it, I was asked if there was anything wrong at the front. Well, no, I replied, it's not the war. It's the post office at Brownsville, Missouri. That first year was also death, taxes, currency depreciation, the national debt. Mississippi River closed, the war dragging on, disastrous and disgraceful, with no prospect of success. General McClellan was laid up with typhoid fever and wouldn't or couldn't reveal his war plans. Jay said he had no money and told me he could raise no more. The bottom was out of the tub, and all the while the country losing patience. Overseas, Britain's cotton mills were hurting for want of cotton, and that caused an unemployment problem for them, especially in Manchester. We had the support of the workers, but their government was threatening to come in on the Confederate side. Now, if they did, France would follow. Something had to be done. I had come to the conclusion that we must free slaves or be ourselves subdued. I actually wrote the Emancipation Proclamation right here in this room. It's quieter here, easier to think. It was my belief that the Constitution invests its commander-in-chief with the laws of war at the time of war, and according to the laws of war, property, including slaves, could be taken when needed. The Confederacy was using slaves to build breastwork, trenches, and all manner of war work. Gave them an advantage we couldn't afford. Now that card had to be taken away from them, or there would be no end to the conflict. As a military measure, I would offer slaves and succession estates their freedom. I showed a copy of the proclamation to my cabinet in late July of '62. They approved, but suggested that I wait for a military success, that as the war was going so badly, it might be seen as a last shriek, a last desperate gasp to turn things around. So I put it in a drawer and waited for a victory. Waited and reflected, like Shakespeare's Claudius, on my fears and hopes for the country. What if this cursed hand were thicker than itself with brother's blood? Is there not rain enough in the sweet heaven to wash it white as snow? Help, angels, make us say, bow stubborn knees, and heart with strings of steel be soft as sinews of the newborn babe. All may be well. A minister once came into my office and told me that God was on the side of the Union. I told him I wasn't at all concerned because I knew the Lord was always on the side of right, but that it was my constant anxiety that I and this nation may be on the Lord's side. It's quite a different matter. 2 months later, Lee left his base in Virginia and invaded Pennsylvania, where it was unsettling, but also an opportunity. His army was no longer dug in, but exposed. Now, General McClellan was shadowing Lee in a parallel line. Although the general had been relieved of overall command of the army, he still commanded the Army of the Potomac with reservations. I mean, some wanted him relieved altogether. They cited his failure to aid General Pope at Bull Run. But I felt he had the confidence of the troops, not a minor factor, and so reluctantly left him in command. Honestly, I would have held the general's horse if he'd only given me military success. On the night before he met Lee's army at Antietam, I went down to my knees and fervently prayed for a victory. In return, I would issue the proclamation. A few days after that battle, I signed an executive order freeing slaves and succession estates with the intention of making the order permanent in 90 days. My prayers had been answered, sort of. A general's a fine engineer and a good organizer, but when it comes to the day of battle, he gets oppressed by a fear of failure. He won the day at Antietam. It might have shortened the war if he had pursued Lee's army. 2 months later, he was relieved, then he resigned, and is currently opposing me for the presidency, running on a peace platform which belies his heroic service to the Union cause. Now, I've heard it said that there are some who do not want to win this war, that the strategy is and has been to prolong it until succession estates are offered favorable terms, independence, and the extension of slavery into new territories and beyond, Cuba, Mexico, South America. If they can't go west, they'll go south. They are that determined and unrelenting, which is why this election is so crucial to the survival of this government as we know it. New York predicts a 40,000 majority from McClellan. Well, if it holds, if it is not reversed, I may win the election but lose the nation. Pressure for an armistice would grow. Once agreed, the country could never go back to war. It wouldn't be feasible. It would mean, in effect, the immediate dissolution of the Union. No doubt the Emancipation Proclamation has been a two-edged sword, and that is reflected in the voting. No doubt some felt and still feel that it did not go far enough. They wanted all the slaves freed, not just slaves in successionist states. Others demanded universal suffrage, but that might have caused us to lose support in border states like Kentucky and Missouri that were still with us. I did favor suffrage for black men who fought, and to that end we encouraged former slaves to enlist, which they did. And that too was a problem for some. They didn't mind fighting to save the Union, but they didn't want to fight to free the slaves. Now, to those who say they will not fight to free the Negro, I say fight then exclusively to save the Union. But when peace comes, there will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye and well-poised bayonet, they have helped mankind on to this mighty consummation. Well, I fear there are some white ones unable to forget that with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they have strove to hinder it. Now, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing slaves, I would have done it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would have done it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would have also have done that. Now, what I now do about slavery, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union, and that is why I issued the Emancipation Proclamation. I signed it on New Year's Day, a day we traditionally have a reception at the White House. I didn't want history thinking there was any reluctance or hesitancy on my part when I signed that document. So despite my sore hand, sore from all the handshaking, I made certain my signature was sure and steady. There could be no going back. I will not modify or retract the proclamation, nor will I return to slavery any person who is free by that proclamation. To safeguard any legal challenge, an amendment to the Constitution must be passed by Congress and ratified by Union states and some of the reconstructed states. Ratification will hasten the end of the war, which is my dearest hope. But if New York and New Jersey both go down, Emancipation Proclamation, the Union, and this brief experiment in a people's government could be no more. Now, some grant. The election having come off quietly is a victory worth more to the country than a battle won. Some thought the general might oppose me for the presidency. His military record would have made him a formidable candidate. Fortunately for the country, he let it be known that his only ambition was to defeat the Confederacy and restore the Union. Certainly he has shown himself to be true to that aspiration. His victories at Fort Donelson and Shiloh in the early months of the war were a beacon of hope where none could be found. Oh, yes, I know his troops suffered heavy losses, especially at Shiloh, and for this he was castigated as a butcher and a drunk. Many wanted him relieved. I suggested they find out the general's brand of whiskey and give it to my other generals. Couldn't spare the man. His victory at Vicksburg, after delays and setbacks, was ingenious and stunning and seemed to put the rebellion on the back foot, especially as it coincided with Meade's victory at Gettysburg. I mean, both victories occurring on the 4th of July seemed almost mystical and roused the country to hope for a quick end to the conflict. Vicksburg opened up the Mississippi Valley. Gettysburg put Lee's army on the defensive. But in one case, enemy soldiers were paroled. And in the other, they were allowed to slip away. Now, don't misunderstand me about General Meade. I am profoundly grateful down to my boots for what he did at Gettysburg. But I think if I'd been the general, I would have fought one more battle. He held the war in his hands and did not close it. And so it continues. It was increasingly apparent to me as things unfolded that I was not in control of events, but that events controlled me. On the day of Meade's victory, serenaders came to the White House. In my brief remarks, a theme began which reached full fruition 4 months later at the memorial service for all those who fell on that battlefield. Day prior to the service, Tad came down with a high fever. Since Willie's passing, Mary was easily frightened and urged me to stay. Well, I was concerned, but I felt I had to go. The occasion was too important. Thousands would be attending. The minister gave a lengthy invocation. It was probably longer than my address. And then for 2 hours, Edward Everett spoke movingly of the battle itself. After another hymn, it was my turn. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met in a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our power to add or subtract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. And I felt the speech was a flat failure. I didn't mind so much myself, but some of those people came an awful long way. Press reaction was mixed, both praise and blame. Some of the latter raged that the speech had broadened the aims of the war from union to equality and union. Well, I can't refute that. To me, the two are inseparable. So many have fallen, not just at Gettysburg, twice at Bull Run in the early days, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness Campaign, Spotsylvania, Petersburg, and so on and so forth. The South as well, with proportional losses. My God, I thought, what will the country say? What will the country say? I looked to Shakespeare. King John seemed to fit. The suns o'ercast with blood, fair day adieu. Which is the side that I must go with all? I am with both. Each army hath a hand, and in their rage, I having hold of both, they whirl us under and dismember me. When Confederate troops invaded Maryland and Pennsylvania a few months ago, the capital was threatened. Some wanted me to evacuate the city. I got so mad I rode over to Fort Stevens, which was being shelled by the Confederates, stood on the parapet and faced the fire. I wanted the troops to see me there. Eventually, I was persuaded to duck. I guess I would have been quite a prize at that. I had a dream the other night that has haunted me ever since. I was up late waiting for important dispatches from the front. I could not have been asleep long when I began to dream. And then I heard people weeping. I thought I left my bed and wandered downstairs. I went from room to room, meeting the same mournful sounds of distress. I was puzzled and alarmed. I kept on until I arrived in the east room. Now before me was a catafalque on which rested a corpse, and around it were stationed soldiers, and there was a throng of people. Well, who was dead in the White House? I demanded of one of the soldiers. The president, he said, he was killed by an assassin. Sleep has its own world. The boundary between things misnamed death and existence. Sleep has its own world and a wide realm of wild reality. It reminds me of the old farmer in Illinois whose family was made sick from eating greens. He said, now before we eat these greens, let's try them on Jake, his bear-fighting boy. If he stands them, we're all right. Well, just so with me, if the imaginary assassin continues to exercise himself on others, I can stand it. Anyway, I'll say no more about it. It was not me, but some other fella. Oh, don't mention that dream to Mary. She's anxious enough without pouring fuel on the fire. Her nerves seem to be always on edge. She lost her mother, when she was very young, about the same age as me when my mother passed. But I was fortunate in that my stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, was someone who brought light and joy into the house, was never partial to her own 3 children above my sister Sarah and myself. Well, Mary, on the other hand, never had the sense that she was appreciated, never outgrew it, and so looks to others for approval of her worth. Now she's buying a lot of expensive jewelry because she feels judged. I know she is not popular in some quarters, but I forbear it because I know she is worthy. New York has been reversed. Yeah, the prediction is now for a 35,000 majority in the city and 40,000 in the state. Well, that's reassuring. Those earlier numbers from McClellan did seem wide of the mark. Let's hope it holds. And Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio seem to be going our way. Well, that should offset losses in Kentucky and New Jersey and Delaware. Nothing yet from Illinois, but if things continue as they are. Oh, by the way, the boys in the telegraph room were sent out for some oysters to keep everyone going. I don't know if I can manage oysters at this late hour. It's well after 3, but you're welcome. I tell you, if Illinois goes south, I'll be sorry I didn't get back there to vote. I've got a lot of history there. We came to Decatur, Illinois from Pigeon Creek, Indiana in 1830. I sold notions along the way and made a profit. I was always looking to profit somehow or another. A year or so later, Denton Offutt came up from New Salem and asked my cousin, John Hanks, to establish a boat enterprise, taking goods to New Orleans. Well, this was in March of 31. Well, John and I came down the Sangamon River in a canoe where a mill dam owned by Mr. James Rutledge stopped our progress. Now, Mr. Rutledge had founded the town of New Salem a couple of years prior to our arrival. Anyhow, after building a flatboat and delivering our goods to New Orleans, Offutt offered me a job working in his New Salem grocery store, and that's how I came to settle there. That's how I got to know Ann Rutledge. In time, we came to an understanding, but it was not to be. She got the fever and passed. Well, that event set me back on my heels. It was so bad I couldn't bear the thought of rain falling on her grave. I truly love the girl, and I think often of her now. I look to Burns for comfort. O thou pale orb that silent shines, where care untroubled mortals sleep, thou seest a wretch that inly pines and wanders here to wail and weep. With woe I nightly vigils keep beneath thy wan, unwarming beam, in mourn and lamentation deep, how life and love are all a dream. Folks in New Salem were concerned about me. They got me a job as their postmaster. And then an opportunity to do some surveying sprang up. I studied Euclid and did that for a time, laid out a few towns thereabouts with my 2 chain men. Something always seemed to come my way. I've always been grateful to the folks of New Salem. Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition. Now, whether it be true or not, I can say for one that I had no other so great as that of being truly esteemed of my fellow men by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. Excuse me. Oysters. Just wanted to show my appreciation. Well, I am forced to confess that I'm relieved of suspense, and am glad that the verdict of the people, including a 20,000 majority from Illinois, is so likely to be clear, full, and unmistakable. Well, I go home and get Mary the news, but that band must have roused her. She's probably up making plans. We might be roused ourselves if we cracked open a couple of those windows. I had thought of returning to my law practice in Illinois if things hadn't gone my way. The law has always, for me, will always hold a fascination. I love to dig up legal questions by the roots and hold them up and dry them before the fires of the mind. Sometimes I'd study legal precedents stretching back to English common law. Well, this was partly self-interest. I didn't dare trust the case on the precondition that the court knows all things. I argued on the precondition that the court doesn't know anything at all. I made a few notes just in case. My law partner was always trying to get me to talk faster, but the long convolutions of my brain won't allow for such an approach. I have to talk slowly. I commence way back like the boys do when they want to get a good start. My weight and speed give me momentum to jump far. I think I'll jump to Europe when my work is done here, and then to the West. I want to see the Rockies, California, the rest of the country. And I guess I'll risk the hassock. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. The present rebellion brought our republic to a severe test, and a presidential election occurring in regular course during the rebellion added not a little to the strain. But the election was a necessity, and now that the election is over, may not all, having a common interest, unite in a common effort to save our common country. For my part, I have striven and will continue to strive to avoid placing any obstacle in the way. So long as I have been here, I have not willingly planted a thorn in any man's bosom. While I am deeply sensible to the high compliment of re-election and duly grateful, it adds nothing to my satisfaction that any other man should be disappointed or pained by the result. May I ask all those who have not differed with me to join with me in the same spirit towards those who have. With malice toward none, with charity toward all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and his widow, and his orphan, to do all that may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Surely God intends some great good to follow this mighty convulsion, which no mortal could make and no mortal could stay. And now, will you do me a favor? Will you play one of my favorite tunes? Will you play Dixie? ended. and now it is late, and with the dawn we have work to do. I thank you for coming. Good night, and God bless. Well, I'll work on it. Oh, and for those of you who have watched with me into the wee small hours, special thanks. I hope I have not kept you from your sleep too long. Enjoy the oysters.